In the shadowed foothills of rural Virginia, where the frost creeps early and lingers late, there once stood a hospital so thoroughly forgotten that it vanished from state records a decade before it was ever officially closed. Briar Glen Asylum opened its iron gates in 1839, a time when medicine barely separated science from superstition and where the line between patient and prisoner blurred beneath gaslight and doctrine. Though many institutions of its era were shuttered in disgrace or rebranded into modern care facilities, Briar Glen seemed to sink deeper into the soil with each passing year. It was a place for the irretrievable, the chronically mad, the war-damaged, the orphaned unwanted, those whose afflictions were either too complex or too inconvenient for polite society to tolerate. But among the hundreds who came through its barred doors, 6 stand apart not for how they lived, but for what was buried in their name. In late October of 1871, a fire tore through the northern dormitory of the asylum. No fatalities were recorded. No patients went missing. The newspapers from Richmond, Staunton, and even Baltimore reported the blaze as minor, swiftly contained, and suspiciously underreported. Yet within the week, 6 fresh graves appeared behind the asylum's overgrown cemetery fence, each marked with identical iron crucifixes and brass nameplates that bore names no one recognized. Not in the patient registry, not in the county death rolls, not in the asylum's own hand-kept ledger of the deceased. Just 6 graves, neatly aligned, filled in haste, and no one, not the caretakers, not the surviving nurses, not even the chaplain who was said to perform the last rites, could say who the dead were. It would have been easy for the story to rot away with the wooden walls of Briar Glen had it not been for the rediscovery of the night logs in 1946 during a failed restoration effort. The logs, preserved in a locked drawer of a rusted filing cabinet, contained erratic but strangely detailed entries from a woman named Lorette Mayhew, a night nurse assigned to the northern wing during the final years before the fire. Her entries begin in mundane fashion, reports of patient restlessness, shortages in linen, complaints of leaking roofs, and faulty furnaces. But by September of 1871, the tone of her writing changes. She begins referencing a patient ward that does not appear on any known floor plan, Ward C, where patients were said to speak in tongues that even the chaplain refused to translate. She records incidents of strange weeping echoing through the drainage shafts at night, and visitors, always at dusk, always silent, who signed no guest books and left no names. In one entry dated just 12 days before the fire, she writes simply, 6 of them, not patients, not staff, but they live here now. They arrived through the basement, and no one asked them to leave. What follows are 6 consecutive night entries in which she refers to unnamed figures standing at the foot of patients' beds, observing silently. Patients in other wings reportedly refused meals, covered mirrors, and begged not to sleep. She documents one incident in which a long-term resident, previously catatonic for 9 years, stood up during supper and screamed, "He's in my name. Get it out. Get it out." Then comes the last entry, dated October 22nd, 1871, the night of the fire. It reads, in its entirety, "The smell of burning teeth. The brass plates are already made. I saw my own name carved into one. They told me I was never here. Tell Father Cartwright the second priest lied. Nurse Lorette was never seen again. The fire destroyed half the northern wing and consumed most of the patient files stored there. Her body was never recovered, and her name appears on no staff lists, payrolls, or family notices, except for a single letter preserved by the diocesan archives in Lynchburg. It was a letter written to her father, a Catholic deacon in rural Georgia, in which she confesses fear for her soul and begs to know whether a priest named Father Alaric Shaw had ever been assigned to St. Arilda's parish. The reply, dated just days before the fire, is clipped and chilling. No priest by that name has ever served in the Diocese of Richmond. Please come home. When the property was finally condemned in 1894, the 6 graves remained untouched, the iron crucifixes rusted, the brass plates dimmed, but none were removed and no one ever dug beneath them. In 2003, a team of amateur historians led by Dr. Frances Collingwood gained limited access to the cemetery grounds under a historical preservation grant. Her preliminary report, never formally published, contains only one surviving field note. Of the 6 graves, only 5 have coffins beneath. The 6th appears empty, and its nameplate reads, Lorette Mayhew. This channel isn't for everyone. It's only for those brave enough to read what the dead leave behind. Before we uncover the rest, subscribe now and tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Because if what happened at Briar Glen was allowed to stay buried, there may be more unclaimed graves in your county than you think. Long before the fire, long before the brass plates and the vanishing nurse, there was already something wrong with the cemetery behind Briar Glen. Even the land itself seemed to resist rest. Established nearly a decade before the asylum's main structure was finished, the cemetery was originally intended for the nearby township of Wickley Ridge, a small farming enclave that had suffered a cholera outbreak in the spring of 1829. The townspeople buried their dead in haste, covering the hill behind the asylum grounds with more than 40 simple wooden crosses marked only with chalk initials. When the ground thawed the following season, the crosses had shifted, some overturned, others missing entirely. The town elders, superstitious and desperate, blamed the disruption on the flooding from the nearby Haversack River. But those who dug to recover the displaced coffins reported something far more troubling: caskets torn open from within, claw marks on the inside of lids, and in at least 3 cases, corpses turned face down with jawbones broken clean off. These findings were quietly passed over by the coroner, whose own sister had been among the first buried during the outbreak. When Briar Glen was constructed 10 years later, the cemetery was expanded, enclosed by a wrought iron fence, and absorbed into the asylum's jurisdiction. Records show that in its first 20 years of operation, 116 patients were buried in that soil, each death documented with obsessive precision in leather-bound ledgers kept in the warden's office. Every page noted the time of death, the attending physician, the condition of the body, the burial time, the weather that day. All but 6 entries, undated, unsigned, written in handwriting that does not match any known staff member, appear abruptly at the back of the final ledger volume beneath a section marked simply Residuals. Each entry begins with the same phrase: name uncertain, burial necessary, no further details. And under each, where signatures should have been, only the letter V appears. No initials, no title, no verification. Just a single slanted mark that cuts through the page like a blade. By the time the fire consumed the northern dormitory, those 6 graves were already in the ground. But what confounded investigators and descendants alike was not simply the mystery of the names. It was the absolute absence of corresponding bodies in the official record. Not a single death certificate, not a single autopsy, not a single report of escape, accident, suicide, or murder. Yet the groundskeepers, when questioned years later, admitted in hushed tones that someone had died. That caskets had indeed been delivered in the middle of the night from a rear access road rarely used by the staff. The local gravedigger, Thomas Ellery, confessed before his death in 1888 that he had been paid in gold, not by the asylum, but by a traveling clergyman dressed in cassock robes bearing no diocesan insignia. Ellery's own journal, found beneath a loose board in his cabin floor, included a charcoal sketch of the clergyman's ring, A thin band etched with 9 small figures bowed before an unlit altar, and beneath the sketch, a single sentence. He said they weren't to be remembered, but something, or someone, wanted them remembered anyway. Within months of their burial, those 6 graves began drawing attention from patients and staff alike. The head nurse at the time, Maeve Curran, wrote to her sister in Tennessee that she had been forced to move the female wards indoors during weekly recreation, as many of the women refused to pass by the new graves. Some whispered that the air around them felt wrong, heavy, that birds no longer sang near the fence line, that dogs refused to cross into the cemetery and barked wildly when facing the direction of the graves. Orderlies who worked the night shift reported lights flickering each time the brass plates were polished, and one janitor, Alfred Keene, left the asylum after claiming he saw the ground move as he trimmed the grass, saying the soil shifted as though someone had exhaled beneath it. The director dismissed these claims as nonsense, attributing the unrest to hysteria, grief, and the institutional paranoia that often plagued long-term staff. But privately, he kept a revolver in his desk and ordered that all future patient burials be conducted off-site. That directive remained in place until the asylum's closure, yet those 6 graves were never disturbed, never disinterred, never identified. The matter might have faded completely had it not been for a chance photograph taken in 1904. A young seminary student named Evan Bollinger, conducting research on early American religious institutions, visited Briar Glen with the intention of documenting the architecture before it fell to decay. Using a handheld Kodak camera and an old glass plate, he captured several images of the grounds, including the cemetery at dusk. When developed, the photograph revealed something deeply unsettling. Behind the 6 iron crosses stood a figure in priestly garments, hands extended, mouth open as if in benediction. Bollinger swore no one had been present. The director, elderly and half-blind by then, denied any knowledge of visiting clergy. But the ring on the figure's hand, though partially obscured, bore a near-identical match to Ellery's sketch. The photograph was quietly donated to a private theological archive and rarely spoken of again until a copy surfaced in the mid-1990s during a renovation at the Richmond Theological Seminary. The archivist, intrigued by the oddity, ran a high-resolution scan and noticed a second anomaly. Behind the priest, just beyond the reach of the iron fence, were 6 faint shapes, each the size and shape of a person, standing, watching. The names on the brass plates were never traced to any known individual in the region's census or asylum rosters. Even the materials of the plates themselves became a point of speculation. None appeared to rust at the same rate, and chemical analysis, decades later, revealed a strange composite of brass and a second unidentified alloy. One local historian, attempting to trace the origin of the metal, remarked that the composition matched no known foundry in the US or Europe at the time. Another theory suggested the names themselves were never meant to identify the dead, but to bind them, that they weren't names at all, but instructions, keys. When the land was finally auctioned in 2007, the buyer, a corporate medical firm with no apparent religious affiliation, ordered the cemetery fenced off permanently. Within a month, the entire property was sold again, this time to a holding company registered under the same name as one of the unclaimed graves. C. Vallon. No company history, no contact number, and no building ever appeared on the site again. Just a fence, a gate that doesn't open, and 6 names that no one claimed, but someone clearly remembered. The earliest death at Briar Glen recorded without a corresponding family visit was that of Martha Pell, a seamstress's daughter admitted for what was then termed involuntary grief fixation after losing her infant to scarlet fever in 1869. She had refused to eat, spoke only to her reflection, and sewed the same sleeve over and over again, muttering the infant's name beneath her breath until her voice rasped into silence. Her death certificate marked exhaustion as the cause, though nurses later admitted that Martha had vanished from her locked room the night before she was scheduled to be transferred to a sanatorium in Covington. No body was found, and yet, the very next morning, a brass plate bearing the initials MP appeared at the far end of the cemetery, affixed to a new headstone that no one admitted placing. The soil was fresh, but no grave had been ordered. Her bed remained unslept in, her nightgown folded on the foot of the mattress. The brass on that particular plate, when exposed to the morning sun, gleamed red, not with rust, but as if heated from within. The warden at the time, Alton Crane, insisted to investigators that no such grave existed and barred them from entering the cemetery, citing decaying conditions and potential for infection. However, his handwritten reports, preserved only because a secretary smuggled them into a local archive before the fire, contains 7 full pages of notes about Martha Pell's name, etched in a style that matched no tools used by local engravers. According to Crane's report, the name had not been scratched into the metal. It had been grown there. That same week, the asylum's chapel bell rang during a stormless midnight, even though the cord had been removed months earlier after a suicide involving one of the male patients. Staff dismissed it as wind or metal contraction, but survivors from that era later wrote letters, never published, only found in private collections, stating that the bell did not toll. It hummed. The sound reportedly lasted exactly 99 seconds and was followed by the sound of heavy breathing beneath the wooden floorboards of the chapel itself. Afterward, a second grave appeared, this time without a plate, just disturbed earth still soft beneath the boots of the groundskeeper who had been on leave the day before. The soil gave off the smell of burnt milk and lilac. No animal tracks surrounded it. No insects crawled across it. The priest assigned to perform routine rites for the deceased refused to go near it, citing the smell of heresy, and resigned his post without explanation. The gravedigger who had assisted in the Pell burial was later institutionalized himself after walking into the Haversack River fully clothed and remaining submerged for 3 minutes before emerging with no explanation, eyes wide, mouth closed, refusing to speak again until the day of his death. When asked during his final days what he saw beneath the water, he simply wrote one word in chalk on his wall: names. In the asylum's west wing, where violent patients were once housed, a wooden beam collapsed unexpectedly in 1872, revealing a hollowed-out space between the plaster and the brick. Inside, workers found a bundle of thin paper scrolls, each wrapped in a strip of cloth resembling baptismal sashes. The ink used in the scrolls was tested in the 1950s during a state-funded investigation and was found to be composed of human blood and ash. The scrolls themselves contained fragments of names, most indecipherable, but one repeated, C. Vallon, the same V that had signed the ledger entries. The same Vallon for whom one of the graves was reportedly purchased in cash and secrecy. The cloth sashes, when unfurled, contained dates, each matching the day of a thunderstorm that hit the region between 1859 and 1871. These storms were previously noted by farmers for their peculiarity: lightning that flashed in patterns instead of streaks, thunder that seemed to echo below the ground instead of above. The townspeople of Wickley Ridge, most of whom never acknowledged the asylum's presence despite its proximity, referred to that hill simply as the Hush, a place where sound seemed swallowed and time moved slowly. Several children reported seeing people walking among the cemetery plots after dusk, figures dressed in burial robes, not hospital gowns. These reports were dismissed until 1873, when a census taker documented 7 individuals residing on asylum grounds who were not listed as staff or patients. When local authorities arrived to investigate, the 7 were gone, but the census forms had been signed in the same looping cursive found in the original burial ledger. One name was repeated twice. One name matched a grave, and when the authorities questioned the asylum's interim director, they found him in the chapel, unresponsive, standing beside the altar with a page torn from a psalter pinned to his shirt. The page was blank, his eyes were glazed, and his mouth whispered a single phrase over and over. "I signed what I saw. I saw what I signed." His condition never improved, and he died exactly 6 months later, on the date matching the scroll marked Valen. After the director's death, a woman named Constance Greer, who had served as the asylum's bookkeeper, surrendered a locked tin box to the local sheriff. She claimed it had been left to her by her uncle, one of the original architects of the facility. The box, when opened, contained an early floor plan of the asylum with 7 areas marked in red ink, none of which appeared on the current layout. One of the marks corresponded to the space beneath the cemetery itself. Not a cellar, not a vault, a chamber, circular, precisely measured, with walls reportedly made of polished stone unsuitable for this region's geology. No records exist confirming that such a chamber was ever excavated or filled. Yet in 1971, during a drought that exposed much of the surrounding riverbed, hikers discovered a large, flat stone protruding from the hill behind the fence. It bore 6 names, none of them matching any known patient. But the last name etched at the center? Valen. And beneath it, a date that did not match any recorded death in the asylum's archive. It matched instead the founding of the asylum itself. What remains most disturbing about the Valen entry, besides the fact that no official ever confirmed his role in any burial or patient transfer, is the series of signatures that began to appear after his presumed death. The same looping V began marking patient transfer records long after the man had supposedly vanished, and in several cases, his name appeared next to patients who were listed as released, but whose families never retrieved them, and who were never seen again. These forms, now yellowed and crumbling in the restricted archives of the Parish Historical Society, show ink inconsistencies that defy period norms. Under magnification, each V glistens faintly in the margins, as though heat had been applied long after the ink dried, as though the paper had been seared in a single curved stroke. Forensic historians in the 1980s noted that the ink used matched none in production at the time. No iron gall, no sepia, no walnut-based dye. It had the chemical signature of ash, blood, and something else. An element unclassified, no longer reproducible. Its sample deteriorated when removed from the vault. Yet the names it had been used to sign all ended up in the same place: unclaimed, unvisited, and eventually buried, or so it was claimed. Between 1863 and 1871, the number of patients marked as unclaimed deceased rose by 300%. Yet only 6 new graves were added to the asylum's private cemetery, and none of them, according to gravedigger account books, were ordered by the warden, clergy, or family. They simply appeared. The stone used was not quarried from the surrounding region. It was too smooth, too dense, and unlike the local shale or limestone. The stonemason who had once provided markers for the earlier plots refused to acknowledge them. In a sworn statement found in his ledger, he wrote simply, "These are not mine. I do not cut what cuts back. When pressed about this cryptic remark, he reportedly fled the parish, leaving behind a letter to his daughter that described hearing whispers each time he approached the asylum gates. He claimed that voices called to him by name, voices he could not place, but that they promised he would be remembered properly if he engraved the forgetting. His final sentence read, "There are places on that hill where names aren't given, they're grown. They sprout in stone like weeds, and they don't die when winter comes." The cemetery was officially closed in 1875, the same year Briar Glen's main hall burned under mysterious circumstances. No casualties were reported, no fire was ever seen. But by morning, the roof had caved in and the foundation had split, as though something had moved beneath it. Staff claimed it was frost damage. Locals claimed they saw smoke with no source. But one nurse, Verna Ellis, who had only been working 3 months, later testified in a private journal found in 1983 that she had seen the bell tower lean at a 45-degree angle, only to return upright before dawn. She wrote that the graveyard was illuminated that night, not by flame, but by a kind of trembling glow that pulsed from the brass nameplates. The names, she said, began to rearrange themselves. The letters shifted slowly like ants following a trail. Then they stopped. Every name was gone, except one. Valen Shi left the asylum 2 days later and never returned. No obituary was ever found for her. She had vanished without leaving a trace. A replacement nurse who took her post 6 months later found something strange in the locked medicine cabinet, a folded paper containing 7 names, each with a date next to it. All those names would become the titles of graves found during the chapel reconstruction in 1881. Graves that no one ordered. Graves that did not contain bodies. When opened, against the orders of the diocese, they revealed only 3 things: a folded sash, a copper crucifix with melted edges, and a cloth bundle of hair tied in twine. None of these were consistent with burial practices of the time. None bore the scent of decay, and yet the surrounding soil emitted the unmistakable reek of embalming salts. One of the opened caskets contained a mirror, cracked. When lifted, the bottom revealed what no one wanted to admit: a reflection that did not match the angle, did not match the person holding it. The groundskeeper quit the same day, walking 6 miles barefoot to the nearest train station. He left behind his keys, his tools, and a note that read only, "The mirror blinked." Briar Glen continued to operate for another 4 decades, despite growing superstition among staff and increasingly erratic patient behavior. Reports of sleepwalking increased tenfold. One woman, Eleanor Flynn, reportedly drew the cemetery repeatedly during her stay, always from the perspective of being buried. Alive within it, she had never seen the cemetery. Her room faced the opposite side of the building, yet each time her drawings included the same misplaced stone marker, one that had been covered by a fallen oak since 1867 and was only rediscovered in 1867-1902. When they cleared the area, beneath the moss and debris, the marker bore one line carved into the base: "He who is remembered twice does not sleep." The handwriting matched none in the asylum records, nor the stonemason, nor any known priest, but it matched precisely the signature on those scrolls found in the wall, the scrolls of blood and ash. When they cleared the stone and tried to move it for maintenance, it would not budge, not even with horses, not even with winches. The stone had rooted itself, a local engineer claimed. It had merged with the bedrock, though it bore no mineral continuity. It simply refused to be moved. In 1910, when Briar Glen was finally shuttered for good, the state began an investigation into the unclaimed remains. They found no remains, only empty graves, only documents with conflicting names. only crosses with names etched over other names, scratched out, reversed, or split down the center. No one could explain why every burial log from 1871 to 1875 contained the same margin symbol, a looped V burned into the edge, not written, burned. When they tried to photograph it, the camera jammed. The photographer went blind in one eye the next morning. No known cause. In the years following Briar Glen's abandonment, locals grew reluctant to even speak its name aloud, referring to it instead as the Hollow Hill or the place behind the fog. The asylum's frame rotted slowly, but the graveyard remained unnaturally intact. Grass refused to overgrow the 6 stones, yet moss grew thickest on their brass nameplates, almost as if nature knew exactly what it was supposed to conceal. In 1926, a traveling photographer named Wallace Emery attempted to document the ruins for a book on lost American institutions. He stayed one night in the groundskeeper's former shack and left by dawn with 79 photos. Only 4 developed. 3 were entirely black. The 4th, now housed in the parish archives under lock and key, shows what appears to be the Briar Glen Cemetery at night, though Wallace claimed he took the picture at noon. The 6 headstones are visible, but something unnatural hovers behind them. Not a person, not a shadow, a curvature, as if the air itself had bent around something massive and transparent. Wallace never published his book. He was found dead 3 months later in his Baltimore apartment, every mirror in his home shattered and the words, "I saw too much," carved into his desk in identical handwriting to that on the original Vallon documents. More disturbing still, the negatives from his camera, sent to a New York developer, arrived blank, except for one strip. It bore only a signature, the same looped V etched as if scorched onto the film itself. For decades afterward, Briar Glen sat untouched, though not unvisited. Hikers reported nausea near the eastern wall. Animals refused to nest within the ruins. Local children dared each other to touch the cemetery gate, but none ever crossed it. In 1949, the land was surveyed for a possible Veterans Hospital expansion. Every engineer who walked the property filed irregular readings on their magnetic compasses. The instruments would spin wildly when nearing the graveyard. Soil samples turned up traces of human ash, but no calcium, no bone, no remnants of coffins or casket nails, only glass fragments and strands of fabric too degraded to test. One surveyor, a man named Grant Holloway, left behind an audio tape he recorded the night before he disappeared. The tape is grainy, mostly wind and static, but one phrase is clear near the end. They were never buried, just remembered wrong. His body was never found, but his shoes were discovered facing the entrance to the asylum's chapel, as if he'd walked there and simply ceased to exist. The doors to the chapel, nailed shut since 1882, were slightly ajar. In the decades that followed, those 6 graves remained unclaimed, not just by family, but by memory itself. Church officials tried to bless the grounds in 1957, sending a delegation of 3 priests and 2 novices. Only the novices returned. One refused to speak again. The other died of sudden pulmonary failure days later. The 2 priests who vanished left behind their vestments neatly folded near the threshold of the graveyard, alongside a single candle that would not extinguish. When the wind blew, the flame bent but never flickered out. The bishop overseeing the expedition sealed the investigation and quietly marked the land as theologically unviable. It remains consecrated but not recognized. The graves are not acknowledged in any cemetery registry, yet they are not erased. They exist in a strange legal limbo, not permitted to be exhumed, not permitted to be blessed again. A priest from another state once tried to bless the names remotely by reciting rites over a copy of the grave ledger. The page blackened mid-prayer, not burned, blackened, as if the ink within it had rebelled. The priest's voice broke on the third name, and he later claimed he felt his tongue being pushed down by something unseen. He would later retire from the clergy, citing moral exhaustion, and was last seen boarding a train to Baton Rouge. His belongings were found in the station locker, including the original Briar Glen page. The names were gone. In their place was a single phrase in handwritten Latin, nomina invocata revertuntur. The invoked names return. Perhaps the strangest episode occurred in 1972 when the local historical society, attempting to digitize regional archives, sent a volunteer named Emile Carter to photograph the stones again. She approached the cemetery at dusk and reported hearing a low, continuous hum, almost like chanting, but without voices. Her camera shutter failed on every frame, not jammed, not broken, simply inert. She described it as if time stopped every time I tried to capture it. In her final attempt, she drew a sketch by hand instead. It showed the 6 headstones as expected, but behind them, she drew what she called an echo of a gate. Not wood, not iron, just the shape of an arch that hadn't existed in the physical world. She labeled it the 7th marker, but there is no 7th grave. There never has been. No record supports it. No stone is visible. And yet, in every piece of folklore gathered from the town's oral history, especially among the oldest families, there is always mention of the one who waits. The 7th, the witness, the name that was never written, because it was never meant to be spoken. It is said this presence oversees the other 6, that the 6 graves are not resting places, but placeholders, that whoever, or whatever, they were for, is not done with them, that the stones mark not the end of lives, but the start of a ritual that remains unfinished. There are even drawings, crude, childlike renderings from students who visited the site on class field trips, showing a 7th grave glowing behind the others. Some children drew it as a staircase, others as a hand reaching upward. One drew a face beneath the ground. All were scolded. None could explain why they drew what they saw. The teacher who oversaw those field trips, a woman named Margaret Allen, later wrote in her diary, "I'm not sure they were drawing what they imagined. I think they were remembering, as if something was shown to them, then taken away. All that remained was the shape. And in the end, that may be the true horror of Briar Glen's 6 graves. Not that they are empty or unclaimed, but that they are not graves at all. They are warnings, locked doors, names written twice to keep something sealed. And perhaps, just perhaps, the 7th name was never forgotten, only hidden, waiting for someone foolish enough to speak it again. The 7th name remained the subject of speculation for generations, but not a single ledger, not even in the sealed records of Saint Etienne's archdiocese, ever listed a 7th patient interred at Briar Glen during its final operating years. And yet, stories persisted, too many, too consistent, and far too specific to dismiss. Beginning in 1880, several asylum staff who had transferred from other institutions described the sensation of being watched in the hallway between wards A and C, specifically near the Eastern Infirmary, now a collapsed corridor overtaken by wild thorn brush. They often reported the sound of footsteps behind them, never heavy, always soft, always bare, as if someone followed them in their stockinged feet, pausing whenever they did. A janitor named Clifford Trask left detailed notes in his maintenance logs, including several entries that read only, "The door was open again," though he never specified which door he meant. In 1881, he vanished between morning and afternoon rounds. His keys were found on the chapel steps, frozen in a half-turn, as if he had been trying to lock something in or out when he was suddenly pulled away. When the orderlies searched the building, they noticed something strange in Ward C's record book. Patient files were numbered in sequence, but file number 1237 was missing, not scratched out, not blank. The number simply didn't exist. The numbering went from 1236 to 1238, as though nothing had ever been assigned to that slot. But during a 1984 renovation of the State Health Archives, a fire-damaged box from the Briar Glen transfer shipment was found sealed under a mislabeled shelf. Inside was a folder marked only with a red wax seal, its impression unbroken. Archivists opened it anyway. There was no file inside, only a thin slip of water-stained paper with a hand-scrawled phrase, "He was never filed because he was never found." There was no name, but there were initials carved into the folder's inner lining, deep, frantic scratches that gouged the cardboard itself. V.R.M. This matched nothing in any staff registry, patient log, or donor record. And yet, parish documents from the era mention a Victor R. Moreau, listed not as a patient, but as a temporary groundskeeper hired for 3 months in 1871, coinciding exactly with the appearance of the 6 unclaimed graves. His contract, strangely, was notarized by someone who does not appear in state employee roles and bore the signature of the asylum director, except the director had died 6 days prior. When questioned decades later, the notary's great-grandson, himself a public clerk, found the original contract tucked into his grandfather's Bible. He described it as brittle, mold-dotted, and smeared in a dark red pigment that never dried. He claimed it gave off an odor like wet ash and lilacs. The signature had been overwritten, not scratched out, written again and again, layer upon layer, until it looked more like a hole burned through the page than an actual name. But the initials, V.R.M., were still visible in the corner. No one knows who Victor R. Moreau was. No portrait, no address, no further mention. Yet legends in the surrounding counties say the name Moreau carried fear long before Briar Glen even existed. Some whispered of a family that dabbled in resurrection lore, even older than Louisiana's Catholic enclaves, arriving from the French colonies with strange knowledge and stranger relics. One tale spoke of a man who arrived in the 1830s with a suitcase of broken mirrors, hiring himself out to hospitals and graveyards as a mourner for the unnamed. He was never paid, never lived anywhere, yet was always at the edge of photographs, always blurred, always just stepping away. In the oral histories gathered in the 1960s by a Jesuit archivist named Father Deschamps, children in Willow Parish referred to a figure called the man with no name but too many faces. One girl's drawing, preserved in the Louisiana Folklore Registry, shows a man in a black coat with 6 masks floating behind his head, and one mask cracked in half. Underneath, she had written he took their names so they could rest. The drawing was dated 1872. Briar Glen had closed in 1871. The 6 graves had never been disturbed, but the rumor of a 7th person, someone who watched the others, someone who stayed behind, never faded. In 2001, a team of amateur historians entered the asylum ruins with thermal equipment, aiming to record residual heat signatures. They had no official sanction, no permits. One of them, a woman named Danielle Kerr, never made it out. Her friends claimed she wandered off near the back corridor and never responded to shouts or flashlights. When authorities searched the premises, they found her camera bag lying on the threshold of the graveyard. Inside was a journal, not hers. The handwriting was archaic, slanted, and too consistent to have been scribbled in the dark. It described 6 hosts chosen during what it called the mirror rite. It mentioned the asylum by name. It ended mid-sentence. One of them heard the bell too early. Now the seventh must sleep without. And the page was torn. Not ripped. Torn, then smoothed, as if someone removed it carefully, then placed it back after deciding not to. There was no blood, no signs of struggle. Danielle was never found. Her phone, found days later in the marsh, contained one photo, 6 graves. But this time, one of them had no headstone, only a ring of scorched grass and a crooked iron stake. It was the middle grave. In the exact center, the others surrounded it like numbers on a clock, and at the base of the stake, someone had tied a black ribbon. That ribbon was tested. It contained fibers not from any known textile, and trace amounts of mercury. The lab technician who ran the analysis went home early the next day and never returned to work. Her resignation letter was mailed in from a town she had never visited before, postmarked on a Sunday, when no mail service was running. That letter ended with one sentence: "Don't say the names out loud," but no names were ever given. That's the horror of it. There are no names. And yet, those 6 graves persist, waiting, intact when everything around them crumbles. Pristine brass, polished by no one. The 7th grave, whether real, spectral, or simply misplaced, is still unmarked, still unspoken, and somewhere in the rotting history of Briar Glen, someone, or something, still answers to initials that were never filed. VRM. Not a name, a reminder that the dead don't always rest. Sometimes they keep the names of others. Sometimes they trade them. And sometimes they simply wait. If there was ever a moment the town of Willow Parish should have sealed Briar Glen forever, it was in the winter of 1913, when restoration efforts were briefly proposed by the State Commission for Mental Health, citing overcrowding at newer facilities. A structural team, comprised of architects and medical advisors, was dispatched to survey the decaying grounds, with specific interest in the chapel, infirmary, and the cemetery, which had become a point of intrigue for paranormal societies across the region. The team stayed only 3 nights. Their final report was filed without signatures, marked abandoned at evaluator request, and every photo they captured of the 6 graves came back overexposed, except one. A single lantern-lit shot of the chapel exterior revealed what none of them had seen while standing in front of it: a faint silhouette standing inside the bell tower. No one had entered the bell tower. The stairs had long since collapsed, deemed structurally impassable, and yet there it was, slightly bowed posture, hands at sides, backlit in the moonlight like an old portrait of someone half erased from memory. A man, they guessed. But the details were blurred. His face elongated by shadow, his clothes oddly indistinct. One evaluator, an architectural intern named Howard Tilling, resigned from public projects after reviewing the image. He later confided to his brother that he had seen the figure blink in the photograph, not the moment the photo was taken, not before or after, in the still image itself. He said the eyes were wrong, not empty, too full, as though they reflected things he hadn't seen yet. 2 weeks after his resignation, Tilling walked into St. Arilda's Cathedral in Baton Rouge during evening mass and collapsed at the foot of the altar, muttering in broken Latin that he hears the bell, and the bell hears back. Parishioners assumed it was a psychotic break. Doctors prescribed sedation, but a Jesuit priest who had served at Willow Parish in the 1940s, long before the town's final relocation, visited Tilling in the asylum where he was later committed. He returned shaken and refused to enter another church for the rest of his life. His only comment: "He's not wrong. The bell does hear back. That's the problem." That same year, the bell rang once, just once, on the anniversary of the asylum's closure. There was no wind, no one nearby. Yet residents from 2 parishes over reported hearing it. One described the sound as a warble, not a chime, as if the metal was crying instead of singing. Another compared it to the sound of water running backward. No bell mechanism had existed in the tower since the 1880s, yet the ring came clearly, unmistakably, once again at 3:17 a.m. The time listed on 6 of the death certificates from 1871, each signed by a different attending, none of whom matched licensed staff. All but one of those signatories were never located in any national register. The 6th was traced to a man named Elias Rook, a former naval medic turned cemetery clerk. His involvement with Briar Glen was never confirmed until 1927, when his great-niece found a locked trunk in his attic. Inside was a preserved baptismal gown, 6 brass pins, a map of Willow Parish, and a hand-drawn diagram labeled "The Circle Beneath." The illustration depicted the chapel, the graves, and an underground room, one that never appeared in any architectural blueprints. Elias had drawn a figure inside that circle, facing upward, hands spread like a crucifix. Below it were 3 words: "It begins again." The gown, when analyzed by preservationists, was determined to be far older than expected. Not 1870s cotton, but 18th century linen, stitched in a French pattern used in only one Benedictine convent, long since burned down in an unrelated fire. The pins, oddly, showed signs of impact pressure as if they had been driven into something soft and then yanked out forcefully. One pin had hair trapped in its clasp, gray, brittle, human, not embalmed. The DNA was incomplete. Partial matches linked to no known family tree in the state or in national databases. The final analysis listed a margin note: possible contamination from sulfuric exposure, but no explanation followed. Years passed, interest faded, yet in 1959, a survey crew installing utility lines near the old asylum reported something chilling: a cavity beneath the chapel that hadn't been detected before. When a camera was lowered through a small borehole, the feed cut out within seconds, but not before capturing a glimpse of something metallic, upright, and suspended, like a cradle or a coffin hung from chains. A faint glimmer of brass shone from the corner. What made investigators halt the operation wasn't the object, but the wall behind it, etched deep into the stone. Running in a perfect arc behind the hanging frame were 6 names, names that did not appear in any asylum registry. None of them matched the graves above, but each name bore one chilling feature. They were all preceded by the phrase, "For the silence of," "For the silence of RS," "For the silence of JN," "For the silence of EL. No one could explain why they were engraved inside a sealed, inaccessible chamber beneath a forgotten institution, nor why the brass object, whatever it was, still swung gently when the air inside should have been still. The footage, played only once, was sealed by the parish council and declared inadmissible in public record due to emotional distress. That same night, the bell rang again. Not once, 9 times, and then never again. Until last year. By the fall of 1960, the state had officially declared Briar Glen architecturally condemned, citing structural collapse and toxic material hazards, yet the core chapel remained largely intact. Locals said the building didn't rot like the rest. It resisted decay. Even the vines refused to root into the bell tower stone, and no birds nested in its broken eaves. A final inspection was ordered in November, this time conducted not by engineers or state health officials, but by a federal historical preservation liaison from Baton Rouge named Peter Langford. Langford, a career bureaucrat with no interest in superstition or backwater folklore, treated the assignment as a formality. He carried a leather-bound journal and a twin-lens Rolleiflex camera, both of which were recovered weeks later at a Baton Rouge rail depot, lost and found with no accompanying ticket or witness. His body, however, was never found. But his last journal entries told a different story. The handwriting shifted midway through the final page, at first methodical and crisp, but then jittery, as though written by someone attempting to document while being watched. The last legible lines read, "The brass nameplates don't face outward. They're angled downward, into the soil, not for mourners, for the buried. They're reading their own names." Below that, an unfinished sentence. "There's something beneath the sixth stone. It's hollow, and it." The next page was torn. The following page soaked in something dark and splotchy, with a faint trace of ash around the edges. His camera, when processed, revealed 24 exposures. The first 19 were of typical landmarks: chapel door, rusted garden gate, overgrown stairwells. The final 5 were all taken within the cemetery. The first of these 5 showed a close-up of grave 4, the nameplate glinting in overcast light. The next was of the chapel's bell tower, photographed from a low angle, capturing what looked like a thin veil of movement behind the shattered slats. The third showed the 6 graves from a high angle, possibly from the edge of the chapel roof, and captured something no one could later rationalize: a ring of footprints circling the graves in the opposite direction of human stride. Not around, but inward, each step angled toward the center, terminating in nothing. The penultimate image showed the chapel interior with a ladder, where no ladder had previously existed, leading up into the collapsed bell tower. The final image was black, but not the accidental blackness of a camera obstruction. It was textured, grainy, and upon close forensic inspection revealed faint lines consistent with a man's face pressed close to the lens, eyes open, unblinking, mouth slightly parted. Whoever, or whatever, was in that final frame had been too close for Peter Langford to have taken the shot himself. His disappearance sparked a brief federal inquiry, but the case was dismissed as a bureaucratic error compounded by personal misconduct. Rumors circulated that Langford's wife had received an anonymous package a month later, a single brass pin and a hand-drawn map of St. Arilda's parish, with one word etched on the back: repeat. She refused to speak of it again, and no one knows what became of the map. Yet 3 years later, during the construction of a new high school 2 towns south of Willow Parish, a bulldozer unearthed 6 identical brass plates buried in a crescent formation. The plates bore no names, only the inscription, "For the silence of," followed by initials that didn't match any known faculty, construction worker, or archived landowner. One plate had been bent inward as though forced down by immense weight. Local officials declared it a prank, but the site was shut down for weeks and the records redacted. Since then, no structure built within a 40-mile radius of Briar Glen has ever lasted more than a decade without incident. Fires, sinkholes, collapses. In 1974, a youth correctional center built near the original asylum road was evacuated after repeated reports of unexplained sounds in the walls, scratching, tapping, and a rhythmic tolling like distant metal echoing beneath the concrete foundation. The sounds always occurred at 3:17 a.m. One guard said he heard a voice inside the cinder blocks, not a scream, a whisper asking for a name. When asked what it said, the guard replied, "Not mine." It asked for someone else's name, said it couldn't leave until it knew all 6. He was found the next morning having carved 5 initials into the back of his hand with a cafeteria fork. The 6th he refused to speak aloud, claiming if he said it, he wouldn't wake up again. That facility was torn down in 1982. The location remains a vacant lot. Nothing has grown there since. Not grass, not moss, not even weeds. Just hard-packed dirt, and 6 indentations barely visible after rain. Locals refer to them as the skipped graves. When it storms, some claim you can still hear the chapel bell 9 times every September, always at 3:17 a.m. The night that followed Nurse Halpern's discovery of the asylum's eastern ledgers was recorded in her own hand as a merciless, soundless vigil, and it marked the beginning of her complete disintegration from reason. That night, July 29th, 1871, was the hottest of the season. Thick and windless, the air heavy with pine sap and dust kicked up by unseen hooves on the Briar Glen back road. According to her final entry, the nurse had returned to her station in the northern ward, her apron soaked and her shoes blackened by earth from the garden path, which she had not consciously walked. She was speaking aloud to no one, speaking of matches and grave wax and names that bled when scratched into paper. Something had changed in the building that evening. Even the orderlies whispered that doors wouldn't stay latched, that windows swelled shut with no rain, that patients who'd not spoken in weeks began crying or quoting verses about betrayal and being swallowed alive. The chapel bell, long rusted in place, was heard to groan slightly at midnight. Nurse Halpern did not sleep. Instead, she sat by the window overlooking the western garden where the 6th grave had been dug, her journal left open beside her, though she no longer wrote in it, only pressed her palm to the pages as if waiting to absorb something through her skin. That same night, a groundskeeper named Edwin Mallerby, who had been employed by the parish since 1853, claimed he saw a figure moving between the rows of headstones with deliberate but unbalanced steps. He said it was a man in clerical garb, but without a face, at least none he could recognize, and none that remained the same from one blink to the next. Mallerby had raised the alarm and lit the lantern, only to find the gate still locked and the chapel door ajar when he returned. Inside, everything was as it had been, except for the pews, which had all been turned facing backward, away from the altar. That detail never made it into the official incident log, but it was whispered among staff and later confirmed by a young altar boy named Micah Thorne, who resigned his position the following week, stating simply, "The pews face God unless he leaves." Meanwhile, within the main ward, 3 patients who had never met began scrawling the same phrase into the plaster walls using whatever they could find: buttons, fingernails, chalk from the medicinal shelves. He is not the first. He is not the last. These incidents coincided precisely with a new record entry that appeared without a known author. A fresh baptism log was inserted into the parish book on July 30th, 1871, listing the same 9 children again, in the same order, but this time with yet another different priest's signature, one that matched none on file with either the Archdiocese of New Orleans or the regional clergy rolls. When cross-referenced with other records, this priest, Father Alban Duval, did not exist. His name had never appeared in birth registries, seminary enrollments, or even in casual correspondence, and yet his signature was identical across the record. Looping, formal, with a break between the L and the final flourish that bore an uncanny resemblance to a stylized fishhook or noose. Experts consulted later could not agree whether it had been forged by the same hand as the other false record, or by someone mimicking it in reverse. Father Griggs, whose health had steadily declined since the drowning, had been placed under supervised care in the rectory attic, his mind drifting in and out of lucidity, often humming low Latin hymns at dusk that no one else recognized. Nurse Halpern visited him only once more. It was her final documented action before vanishing. She brought with her the original baptism logs, the garden ledger, and a vial of holy water drawn from the chapel font, which had begun to develop a metallic sheen despite no known contamination. She knelt by his bedside, reportedly saying, "We have all been named now, all but one, and they know which of us wrote the truth." Griggs is said to have cried, but the attending deacon who witnessed this exchange, Brother Kent, swore her tears were not her own, but left stains like rust from her fingertips that no cloth could remove. That night, the final grave was found disturbed, not dug open, but pressed down as if something below had exhaled or shifted, leaving a small depression at the head of the mound. The brass plate on that grave read, Clara Jean Hill, a name that again appeared in none of the asylum's registries, but was carved into the wooden railing of the children's wing stairwell, the carving so deep that it had broken through the banister and revealed older, faint lettering beneath it. That older name, still partially legible beneath the splinters, read C.H. Duval. The connection was enough to send one orderly into fits of nausea and another into resignation. The brass plate was removed for analysis, but later reported missing from the superintendent's office the following week. No one claimed responsibility, and the key used to lock the case was still in the safe. Around this time, Briar Glen's grounds began to change. Vines that had been dormant for years began growing at unnatural angles, spiraling into knots that resembled numerals or letters depending on one's vantage point. Visitors who arrived during daylight began reporting strange reflections in windows where no glass remained. One nurse, Enid Ferrier, recalled seeing a small figure in a baptismal gown staring up from a rain puddle where no child had stood. She transferred out 2 days later and never returned to nursing. As for Nurse Halpern, her disappearance remains one of the only entries in the sheriff's log from August 1871. Her bloodied apron was found in the locked chapel, her boots still placed beside the prayer bench, and her journal open to a final blank page. Written in the margin, in a cramped, unfamiliar hand, were the words, "They weren't baptized for salvation. They were baptized to be seen." That cryptic phrase became the focus of numerous investigations in the decades that followed. What did it mean to be baptized to be seen? Were the children offerings, echoes, or were they merely vessels marked for something that required a name, a witness, and a lie to exist? By now, the parish had lost all will to investigate further. The archdiocese sent word that the chapel was to be decommissioned, the cemetery sealed, and the remaining patients transferred or discharged. But by then, too much had been stirred. Too many names falsified. Too many rites undone. And still, the final baptismal record bore no correction, only a signature that no one could explain, and a date etched so deeply into the vellum that it bled through to the next page. Briar Glen would never recover, not from the records, not from the graves, and certainly not from the children. 9 names, 2 logs, 1 drowned priest, and a second man who never lived. And in the silence that followed, the bell in the chapel, once rusted still, rang once more, though no wind passed and no hand pulled its cord. By the morning of July 30th, 1871, the chapel at Briar Glen stood sealed once more, not by any official order or administrative decree, but by the quiet, unanimous consensus of a staff too unnerved to enter, too frightened to question the chain of events that had spilled from its rotted pulpit and warped pews. The basin had emptied again by sunrise, leaving behind only a faint ring of mineral salt and something darker, Copper-colored traces dried into the stone that none could explain. Father Clemens refused to speak of it, locking the chapel with his own hands and surrendering the key to the asylum's central office, where it remained in a drawer that was never opened again during his tenure. Nurse Halpern, though her final actions had not yet been exposed, had not been seen since the night of the basin's last filling. Her quarters were discovered in disarray, pages torn from the baptismal register scattered across her floor like confetti from a forgotten mass. Her trunk was missing, as were several sealed envelopes she had once stored inside, containing, it was said, correspondences with someone named simply D. More chilling still was what the orderlies found beneath her mattress, a flattened bundle of wax-sealed papers, each one a copy of the 9 baptism certificates, each one replicated in her handwriting, but with the priest's signature changed to a different name, not Father Clemens, not even Duval. Each bore the name A. Vauquelin, a name no one at Briar Glen recognized, and when inquiries were made to the diocesan archives in Baton Rouge, no priest by that name had ever served in the state of Louisiana, or anywhere in the diocese's 80-year history. The handwriting matched none of the existing asylum staff, and yet each signature was identical in flow and pressure, as if traced, but no indentation marked the page beneath. Father Clemens, shaken beyond his usual stoicism, insisted that Nurse Halpern had never been authorized to handle sacramental records, let alone conduct any baptisms, duplicated or otherwise. But when pressed about the events of July 29th, he faltered. He admitted, quietly, that he remembered seeing her in the chapel that evening, kneeling in front of the font and murmuring Latin phrases he had not taught her. When asked why he had not intervened, he responded with a single sentence, because the voices weren't hers. By August 2nd, the 6th grave in the asylum cemetery had been filled, not by official directive, and not by any court or family claim, but by the staff themselves, who agreed, without ever quite speaking of it aloud, that the lingering dread from the chapel had settled over the unburied grave like a shadow. They carried a pine casket, hastily built and unblessed, and placed it in the ground with no rites. No one remembered where the box had come from. Some said it had been delivered with the linen shipment the week before, but the records showed no such delivery. Others whispered that it had been pulled from the sub-basement storage, where unused relics from earlier decades had long since been forgotten. When the grave was finally sealed, the brass nameplate affixed to the cross read J. Halpern, though no one admitted to carving it, and no one could explain why the font matched the other 5. By then, the atmosphere within Briar Glen had turned unmistakably sick. The walls groaned at night. Patients screamed not in fits, but in slow, rhythmic wails that matched no language. One nurse described hearing prayers in reverse echoing from the unused wards, always from corners where no patients were housed. And in the laundry, linens repeatedly emerged, stained with black streaks no soap could remove. Streaks that, when inspected under sunlight, revealed faint letters and dates, always the same 9 names, always the year 1859. It was during this fevered period that one of the orderlies, a man named Josiah Tibbet, took it upon himself to revisit the asylum's bell tower. It hadn't been used in over a decade, not since a windstorm had cracked the mechanism, and Father Clemens had forbidden its repair. Tibbet ascended the narrow stair on August 5th, claiming he had heard the bell ring the night before, not once, but 9 times. What he found at the top was enough to send him into a stammering fugue for nearly 3 days. The bell, cracked clean through the yoke, was still coated in cobwebs and dust, but the rope, frayed, brittle, and unreachable from below, was freshly worn along the grip line. And on the wooden platform where no one had stood in years, Tibbet found 9 wet footprints, bare, human, and leading directly to the bell's base. He left Briar Glen that same day, never returning. The administration dismissed his account as heat stroke and hallucination, but the nurses began, locking the tower door with an iron chain. By mid-August, 2 more staff had resigned. The official records show nothing. No unusual deaths, no criminal investigations, no mention of grave 6 or the duplicated baptisms. The name Vauclain was quietly scratched out of the parish ledgers with a red quill, and the chapel, once sealed, was later rebricked entirely during renovations in 1873, the doorway erased, the font shattered and buried beneath the rose garden. But those who remained at Briar Glen never truly forgot. Not the scent of old wax in the hallway outside the chapel, not the faint ring of the bell each September, always on the 9th night, always at the same hour, nor the 9th grave, which over the decades never sank, never settled. The earth remained flush with the ground, untarnished by time, as though something beneath refused to rot, or had never been buried at all. And in the margins of a tattered staff journal found years later in the East Wing attic, someone had scrawled 9 names, first in black ink, then again in red, all matching the duplicated records. And beneath them, in a hand no one could verify, 3 final words: baptized, not saved. The decades that followed saw Briar Glen change hands, then change purpose, but never quite shed the silence it had inherited after the 6 graves were filled. By 1903, it had been reclassified as a sanatorium for war-sick veterans, the kind returned from Cuba and the Philippines with ailments the medical books couldn't label. Shell shock, they called it then. Hallucinations, tremors, long spells of silence broken by sudden bursts of clarity in which the afflicted spoke of things that had no bearing on their service records. Yet oddly, in the records of those who stayed longest in the Old West Wing, where the 6th grave could be seen from the cracked veranda, the descriptions began to share common details. Not just similarities in tone, but in names. One patient, a corporal whose mind had been shattered by jungle heat, drew the same 9 first names over and over in the margins of his Bible. Another, a lieutenant who never spoke until his final week, uttered only 1 sentence before his death. The priest without a face baptized us twice. No one understood what it meant, but the orderlies who cleaned his bed later found his mattress stuffed with torn scraps of what appeared to be church records, too stained to read clearly, but bearing the unmistakable crest of St. Arilda's. The administration dismissed it as wartime delusion, but over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every September, without fail, those assigned to night duty near the garden where the chapel once stood reported hearing the bell. 9 tolls, always spaced precisely 1 minute apart. The bell, of course, had long been removed, taken down during the 1873 renovations and reportedly melted for scrap. And yet the sound persisted, not just to 1 or 2 staff members, but to entire wings of patients who would all sit upright at once, eyes wide, heads turned toward the west-facing windows. In 1922, Dr. Elliot Jameson, a new administrator fresh from Boston and steeped in Freudian theories, sought to break the lingering spell of the asylum's folklore. He ordered the 6 graves exhumed, hoping perhaps to lay old ghosts to rest with a final sweep of clinical certainty. What he found instead was a catalog of impossibilities. Grave 1 contained a coffin, yes, but it was empty. No bones, no cloth, just a faint scent of myrrh and cedar that lingered in the air long after the lid was lifted. Grave 2 contained what appeared to be a child's skull, though the records listed a middle-aged woman. Grave 3 was never opened. Its nails were fused by some chemical corrosion none of the grounds crew had ever seen, resisting every pry bar and blowtorch with a stubbornness that unnerved even the veterans. Grave 4 held a collection of damp ash and nothing more. Grave 5 was filled with rainwater, though the ground had been dry for weeks. But it was Grave 6 that truly undid Jameson's resolve. Beneath the surface lay not a coffin, but a wooden cradle, sealed, intact, and clearly never meant for burial. Within it, according to the two assistants who dared lift the lid, was a bundle wrapped in baptismal cloth, stitched with the initials AV tied shut with human hair. The assistants both fell ill within the week, one developing a fever that caused him to speak fluent Latin, a language he'd never studied. The other suffered a complete breakdown and was later institutionalized in Briar Glen's own ward. Dr. Jameson left Louisiana within the month, reportedly suffering from violent dissociative episodes. His notes were confiscated by the board, his findings never published. Yet among the remaining pages of his journal, found in the sanatorium attic during its 1945 closure, was a single entry circled in red. There were never just 6. The 7th grave is beneath the floorboards. That line prompted an unofficial excavation 2 years later when urban explorers broke into the now abandoned facility, guided by rumors passed among local thrill seekers. What they found beneath the west wing floor was not a 7th coffin, but a baptismal bowl, cracked and dry, and beneath it, a slab etched with the names of 9 children. Not 6, not 7, 9. The names matched the original parish records of St. Arilda's, including 2 not previously known to historians. And most terrifying of all, a 10th name had been added beneath the others, but scratched over repeatedly until illegible. The explorers, all students from Tulane, fled the scene before documenting the full find. But photographs surfaced later on underground forums, grainy, dimly lit images of the slab, the bowl, and one corner of what appeared to be a wall etched with dozens of identical priestly signatures. A. Vauquelin. The name appeared over and over, slightly different each time, as though each were, signed by a hand that forgot how it moved. The state condemned the building the following year. The site was bulldozed in 1949, the earth salted per diocesan instruction, and no official historical marker was ever erected. But locals say that in late September, if you walk the perimeter of where Briar Glen once stood, you can still hear the bell toll, 9 soft strikes, each one echoing like a question left unanswered. And sometimes, in the dust near the weeds where the old chapel once leaned against the hill, you'll find child-sized footprints that go nowhere. The last known investigation into the graves of Briar Glen was not carried out by any official board, university historian, or government agency, but by a woman whose connection to the asylum was, for many years, unknown even to herself. Her name was Clara Bernat, a librarian from Shreveport who had developed an obsessive interest in Louisiana's forgotten institutions, particularly those involving unexplained deaths and ecclesiastical involvement. She'd found the initial traces of Briar Glen in a 1911 collection of ecclesiastical correspondences stored in the vault of the archdiocese, letters between 2 unnamed bishops discussing the children of the drowned priest, and a site where interments had taken place without canonical authority. At first, Clara thought the term children was figurative, perhaps spiritual offspring, acolytes, or orphans cared for by the clergy. But the further she dug, the more disturbing the details became. In the margins of one heavily redacted letter, she found a list of initials written by hand, each followed by a date in 1859. They matched the names from the duplicated baptism records at St. Arilda's. Clara's obsession drove her to dig through death certificates, weather reports, and even old shipping logs, and what she found shocked her. On the night of Father Antoine Vauquelin's drowning, the Mississippi's current had not been strong. No other drownings were reported, no weather disturbances, no swollen tides, and the body, according to coroner's notes she found in a private collection, had been found with lungs full of ash, not water. Ash. It made no scientific sense. The cause of death was listed as drowning, but the body had not inhaled water. It had inhaled what looked like pulverized sacramental charcoal, the kind used in certain exorcism rituals. Clara's inquiries were repeatedly stonewalled. Requests for access to sealed diocesan records were denied. Phone calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back. But through the help of an archivist in Natchitoches who admired her persistence, she was granted a single afternoon to view the Restricted Acts Book of St. Arilda's, a ledger kept from 1841 to 1867, containing priestly annotations not meant for public eyes. Near the end of the volume, in tight and slanted script, was an entry from 1859 written by an unknown hand. 9 blessed in duplicate, first by fire, second by falsehood. One has returned, the rest sleep beneath the 6th. Clara froze. That entry had not been catalogued by the parish historians. It existed only in the margins, almost as though someone had added it later and hoped it would be ignored. One has returned. She couldn't let go of that phrase. Returned from where? Or worse, returned as what? She reanalyzed every name, every baptism, and started combing local census and parish records for any child who might have matched the identity of the 9th. Her breakthrough came not through government records, but through an obituary. A girl named Mireille Cousteau, born in 1859 and baptized by Father Vauquelin, died in 1864 of a fever, or so her death certificate claimed. But further research showed no burial record, no plot, no memorial. And 5 years later, in 1869, another Mireille Cousteau appeared. Same age, same birthday, same parish, entering a convent in Baton Rouge under the Sisters of Lamentation. Clara cross-referenced signatures. The 2 records matched exactly. The same handwriting, the same stroke on the X. Impossible for someone who had supposedly died at 5. So what if she hadn't died? What if she had disappeared, reappeared, or been returned? Clara tracked the convent archives. The second Mireille had served 27 years before, vanishing without any formal release or death notice. And the final document she left behind was a letter to the Mother Superior, which read, "I have seen the cradle again. They are still inside, but one of them stands outside the circle now. She hums while the others sleep." Clara's hands trembled when she read it. It matched the dream accounts from veterans, from children born long after the asylum closed, from priests who'd served at Arilda's and claimed to hear lullabies beneath the confessional. The trail ended at Briar Glen. Clara made her way there in 1998, when the land was still a ruin of red clay and ivy-choked footings. What she saw there was never documented formally, but her personal field journal, later recovered from her estate, describes an encounter she never expected. She wrote of standing near the grave markers when the light shifted suddenly, not like dusk, but like a lantern being slowly lowered over her eyes. She heard 9 knocks, soft and deliberate, behind her. When she turned, the chapel was not there, but she remembered it being there. And standing near the edge of the place where the sanctuary once sat was a girl, pale, hair tied in a knot, holding a candle that didn't cast any light. "Did he sign yours too?" the girl asked, though her mouth never moved. Clara couldn't answer. She didn't run, didn't scream. She wrote only this: "The name on my baptismal record, Vauquelin. But I was born in 1967. She had never noticed until that moment. She had always assumed it was a coincidence, but now she wasn't sure. Had someone repeated the ritual, duplicated the process? And if so, how many others were walking around with borrowed names, mirrored souls, second signatures? When Clara died in 2003, her ashes were interred in a public cemetery with no known family present. The only mourner was the archivist who helped her, who later wrote in a private letter, I stayed until the last shovelful of earth was packed, and just as I turned to leave, I heard a bell ring once, just once. The sky was clear, but I swear to you, I wasn't the only one who heard it. No monument stands today to honor the 6 who were buried without name or family. The land where Briar Glen Asylum once stood is now overrun with choking vines, ironweed, and the hushed rot of southern silence. No historical plaque mentions the chapel, no local guidebooks describe the graves, and the current owners of the property, a distant forestry consortium, have no record of purchasing it. The graves are still there, though no path leads to them. Those who do find them speak of a peculiar heaviness, not just in the air, but in the chest, as if the very act of approaching stirs a resistance, not physical, but ancient. Some say the soil hums faintly underfoot, a near imperceptible vibration that disappears once you retreat. A few have spoken of dreams that come after visiting, the same 6 children, dressed in matching linen nightgowns, standing behind a frosted glass pane, watching, never speaking. One carries a small brass bell, another turns pages of an invisible book, a third scratches her name onto the inside of the glass, except the name she writes is always the same as the dreamer's. One woman, a theology professor from Tulane who went searching after reading Clara Bernat's field notes, wrote in her own journal that after kneeling at the site, she heard a single Latin word whispered into her left ear, iterato, again. She found that word carved into the back of her own baptismal certificate days later, where it had never appeared before. Briar Glen no longer exists on any official registry. The diocese that once oversaw St. Arilda's disavows any knowledge of the duplicated baptisms, and the chapel records containing those mysterious signatures, one real, one false, are now sealed, declared incomplete and irrelevant by church archivists. Yet for those who felt its pull, Briar Glen remains dangerously present, like a skipped heartbeat or a forgotten prayer. Something unfinished, waiting. The phenomenon of duplicated baptism has since surfaced in other parts of the world, always the same pattern. Exact names, identical dates, matching rituals, but signed by priests who either died years prior or who never existed at all. These anomalies aren't recorded in theological debates or canon law journals. They are whispered across candlelit dormitories and convents, muttered during late confession by priests too afraid to say them aloud. There's even a term among the Sisters of the Pale Mercy, baptismo umbra, or baptism of the shadow. They believe it creates a copy, a mirrored soul, one of light, one of silence. They do not claim to understand which survives. What remains is the bell. Every September, like clockwork, a single chime rings out at dusk from where the chapel once stood. No structure remains to hold it, no rope to pull, but it tolls, always once, never twice. Parishioners nearby, those who've lived in the region for generations, pretend not to hear it. But their windows are always closed that evening. Candles are never lit. Children are not allowed near the marshes. And among the few who still remember the name Briar Glen, there exists an unspoken superstition. If the bell rings twice, one of the 6 has found their voice again. And if the bell rings thrice, then they've remembered yours, the documents that survived, Clara's journals, the unsigned Acts book entry, the burnt sacramental register from 1859, all remain locked away in a special archive deep beneath a private theological library in Baton Rouge. The collection is officially designated as folklore, not fact, and is categorized alongside angelic visions, Marian apparitions, and other non-empirical manifestations. But the lead archivist, now in his 70s, refuses to enter that vault alone. He claims he once heard the pages rustling in sequence as if someone were reading. He He never found the source, but when he left, the folder marked Vauclin had been moved 3 inches to the left. No surveillance footage, no power outage, just a subtle reminder. Some records do not wish to remain closed, and perhaps that is the legacy of the 6 unclaimed graves. Not tragedy, not mystery, but unclosure. Their lives began twice and ended once, but their memory echoes in reverse, not forward, but backward, in whispers, in water, in the bell that no longer hangs. The final recorded mention of the duplicated baptisms appeared not in a religious document, but in a poem found tucked into the back of a Louisiana hymnal in 1903. The author is unknown. The ink had not faded. The paper was not aged. And it read, "They came from ash. They walked in ink. Their names were carved but not in stone. One priest sang. The other sank. The cradle cracked, but none were grown. Beneath the bell, they still recite. Once was wrong, twice is right. No one knows who wrote it." But the final page of the hymnal bore an odd ink-blotted signature. The name Mireille. Beneath it, a date, 1859. And below that, written in red ink that hadn't bled through the page, Iterato,